When I was growing up, one of my sisters was a victim of domestic abuse. I remember seeing the bruises on her face and the worry and concern. But for myself, I left college, didn't like doing sixth form, and got into a relationship with a man. Yeah, it became a violent relationship, very coercive, physical violence as well. It was really, really difficult, and I never told anybody at all. I covered up the bruises. I called the police, but at that time, policing was very rigid, and they just said, well, if you call again, we'll put your child on a child protection plan, which I understand now why, working in this area. But that just left me at a place where I couldn't phone them again. So I felt quite helpless. But eventually I managed to, get out of that relationship. But it really left me thinking, like, what on earth was that? Like, how was I a victim? I'm quite bolshy, opinionated, always been quite tomboy-y. I need to understand what this was. So I went to a library in the olden days when people read books, and I found a book on coercive control. And I was like, that's it. The violence was bad, but the coercion was constant. Male patriarchy and men's dominance of women. And I thought, yeah, what happened to me fits there. So I thought, right, I'm going to find out about this. So I actually did an access course to allow me to get into university, the University of Lancashire. I studied all the modules I could. I did the psychology of violence, and I was really hooked. It was fantastic. So interesting about violence generally. But you do a third year project where you have to do your own research. And I wanted to understand why men hit women, because I understood that my partner cared for me, but then he was also violent and abusive and controlling, and I couldn't really reconcile it. So I went to the only professor doing the research at that time, Professor John Archer, and said, oh, I'd like to do a project on why men hit women. And he said, well, women hit men too. And I was scandalized. I was like, I don't think that's true. And he said, well, go away and prove it then. So I was like, okay. So I trotted off. I was reading all these papers and came across a paper by Michael Johnson about coercive control and so forth. And I thought, that's it. Men might hit women and women might hit men, but men are the ones who are coercive. That coercive control is something men do. And I did a research study on it, and I looked at men in prisons and women in refuges, got quite a good sample, and confirmed everything I believed. But women might use violence to men, but they're not coercive. It's more reactive. I was happy with that. We got it published, which was incredible. So was able to go on to do a PhD with John Archer. It was about halfway through where I realised I actually hadn't done a very robust experimental design, because I had men from prison and women in refuges. And I thought, oh, goodness, I need to really do a sample where I'm just surveying just ordinary men and women, equally. And when I did that, everything changed. There was equal rates, if probably more violence self-reported by women. I also asked the women and men, what do you do and what does your partner do? And, it was pretty equal, and I was like, wow, where do I go from here? It was a real struggle, because I had to really rethink everything I thought. But I thought, well, this is interesting. It's, it's important. I believed. So I started presenting at conferences. I'm trying to publish. I published my first paper, and it was cited hundreds of times. I got a better design, a much bigger sample. I did get it published, which is good. It was harder. The reviews were more stringent. And when I went to conferences where I'd always been welcomed, there was a silence in the room. And it was so strange. I just thought that we were all just didn't know. But it appeared that actually maybe some people did know and didn't really want to talk about it, or just didn't believe the findings. And I got stuck in this area because I'm like, this is happening, we can't ignore it, but it just appears that we can.
It sounds very similar to my own journey. People enter this space because they talk about violence against women and girls. And it seems like so often when they actually explore that phenomenon in a politically unbiased way, so many uncomfortable realities are brought to the surface. I found it very interesting as a content creator. I thought, this is so fascinating. When I release this information to the world, everything's going to change. Everyone's going to know all about it. And it's amazing
Mhm,
how
mhm,
people are intent on sticking their fingers in their ears and not listening, despite evidence such as yours and many more besides that. There seems to be three people. When you reveal the truth of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, there are people like you and I who find it fascinating and want to dive in.
mm,
There are people that are terrified and sort of leave and want to run away. And then there's the third type that just want to smash it all and they're angry. They
mm,
don't want you to do the research and they try to stop you.
mhm,
For me, if I was to talk about the thing that I found to be most controversial within what I've learned about intimate partner violence is the idea of bilateral violence, which, as you
uh-huh,
know, is where both partners are violent. It's not him doing it or her doing it, it's both of them doing it in a cycle of violence. And 50% of violence, as you know, is considered bilateral. And that's
mhm,
what I think most people struggle to overcome, because that means 50% of victims are violent. And we all have friends
mm,
or ourselves who have experienced these things. And to acknowledge that half of them are also going to be perpetrators, it's like offensive and it's insulting and upsetting. But
mm.
what can you say to people listening to help them not react in such a knee-jerk way and to sort of widen their perspective of intimate partner violence, where it's not blue team versus red team, good guy versus bad guy? And can you paint a bit more detail for that picture?
Yes, it is hard for people to reconcile because of how domestic abuse has been framed. And even sort of logically, you think, well, man's a lot bigger than a woman, and how can this be equally damaging and so forth? But we have to work with what's actually happening. And if you've got two violent partners, then they both need, an intervention. They both need to be held to the same standards, really, because where somebody's using violence, there are people who are psychopathic. There are people who enjoy harming others. All of us know that, but they're a small percentage of the population. And most domestic abuse, it appears, is quite reactive. You can't generalize to any one relationship on any of the statistics, but you've got to recognize across the board that bilateral violence is a thing. And, this is important because if you only care about women, then women in a bilaterally abusive relationship are far more likely to be injured than women where they're not using violence and the man is. And we also see this in same-sex relationships, so it's not a man-woman thing, it's a relationship thing that happens, where we find actually, interestingly, the highest rates of domestic abuse is in same-sex relationships where there's two women. If we deny that because it doesn't fit our worldview, then we're leaving people in relationships that are dangerous, and if they have children, they've got two parents who are using violence, and, the impact on the children is going to be even more severe. They haven't even got a safe parent in that home.
That was one of the things that shocked me most recently,
Mm,
learning that both bilaterally violent women and bilaterally violent men are more likely to cause an injury than a unilaterally violent man. So the stereotype of
mhm,
a male-only violence, that man's less likely to injure his partner than both a woman and a man in a bilaterally violent relationship. And now I'm sort of trying to think about what the critics are saying. And when they talk about bilaterality, they're going to assume that we're talking about self-defense. This is a man who's being violent to a woman, and she's actually just defending herself. It's not bilateral. It's his violence and her defending herself. So, is there a difference between bilateral violence and self-defense?
Yeah, I mean, certainly people do use violence in self-defense, but really what we know is when you actually ask people why they use violence, it isn't normally self-defensive. The more common thing is to get my partner to understand my point of view, get my partner to stop doing something or to do something. It does tend to be an emotionally driven behavior. I mean, if somebody's being violent and then somebody else retaliates and, they may feel that they're justified in doing so, and they may well be justified in doing so, it is more likely then that will escalate into a fight.
One of the things you mentioned in your previous answer was this idea of coercive control. What sort of actions do you consider to be coercive control? Maybe even examples from your past relationship.
So when when you've got a coercive partner, every relationship's unique, obviously, but certainly with my experience, that coercive control was around jealousy. If I go out and then I'm not back at the time I'm meant to be back, then I'm anxious then, because I know when I come back, there's going to be a really bad vibe. Things would start building, and that was the thing; it would build. So it wouldn't always happen straight away. It often happened a few days later, but it built, and my partner would go quiet and irritated and moody. And then in my case, it was when we go out on a night out, and then the alcohol's there, which reduces
Mm.
self-control as well, then that would be when it would explode. But it isn't just about the actual violence, it's the fact that there's this feeling of threat. Something's going to happen, you're going to be punished. And it could be violence, it could be any number of things, but it just means in the end that you just self-censor. You don't go out, you make sure you're back. You don't wind them up, you know. In my case, I made sure the house was tidy and try and keep everything on a level pegging. And I always like to have friends round because that was obviously protective. So you start managing yourself in a way that you're trying to stop that tension building where there's going to be, violence at the end of it. And once it starts, in my experience, it's going to happen. You just don't know when. It's like walking through a minefield. You're going to blow your leg off sooner or later, but you just don't know which step's going to be the one that triggers it. Then that's all consuming, because you just have to order your life around keeping that person calm, and you can't.
I think a lot of people relate to that. Like, I think everyone's probably had
Mm.
some sort of experience in that area. It sort of brings you back to, on a previous call, we talked about coercive control, and you said everyone uses some act of coercion at some point in their life in any sort of relationship. So, be obviously a very sensitive topic, but what is the difference between just a normal relationship versus coercive control, where it's a criminal matter and something to be taken seriously? And what do you mean when you said everyone at some point will use some sort of coercion in a relationship?
Yeah, we all use it in all of our relationships. If someone does something that annoys you, or you feel slighted or, ignored, then you might be quiet and snappy, and you might do other types of things. We do that, and it's natural. You don't always want a big fight. Well, everyone can be coercive. It's when that coercion is sustained, and particularly where there's violence as well. There's this ultimate punishment that's coming. So you have to then start changing how you behave and what you do to try and stop that and make sure everything stays calm. And it's exhausting.
And you said that was in some ways worse than the violence itself.
Yeah. The violence is bad, but it's normally, it happens quick. Even if it goes on for, 5 or 10 minutes, it's done. And when it's done, until the next time. But the coercion, it's felt all the time. And even when they're not being coercive, you're still trying to act in a way that means that they won't become coercive. So it is just that constant pressure.
No, walking on eggshells sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Walking on eggshells is exactly what it is. Yeah.
So there's another place where you have to walk on eggshells, and that is, you mentioned that earlier too, as a researcher, you present a lot of very strong evidence-based findings that a lot of people don't want to hear, particularly around violent women and coercive women. Do you feel like you're walking on eggshells a little bit when you're in conferences or giving presentations along the lines that you discussed? And why is that? Why is so much of the domestic violence industry so adverse to hearing what is just plain evidence-based data?
Yeah, well, because I've always been quite secure, like being supervised by someone like John Archer, who's one of the leading researchers in this area, it gave me the confidence in what I found, which was nice. So I was always clear, and I was clear about the limitations of my research and other people's. But because I was confident that what I was saying was correct as to what I found, I didn't find I walked on eggshells, because it's not really, bizarrely, as I have been in a violent relationship and walked on eggshells for many years, I've never really done that in other areas of my life. So I was always, I'm going to tell the truth, and I'm just going to let people discuss it and say, if you don't agree, tell me what what I'm doing wrong, what's wrong with my design, what should I be looking at. So that's always been my approach. I've always been very interested. I wanted to talk about it. I want people to talk about why they don't believe these research findings. But what you find is they often won't talk about it. They just don't like it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I get it in a
Mhm.
more everyday capacity where someone will leave a stupid comment saying that I'm misleading people, and then you do exactly that. Well, can you explain where? Sometimes in a private
Yeah.
conversation, sometimes in the comments, and they've never actually brought up a valid point. It's really annoying because I'm actually genuinely would like to know where that people think I get it wrong,
Yeah.
but it so often seems to be they don't like what I've got to say rather than actually thinking like I've done something misleading.
Yeah. And you want to know, don't you?
Yeah.
If I'm getting it wrong, tell me. Yeah. Tell me what the issue is. I'll go and research it. I promised this before. I'll research it. I'm interested in things that you find yourself in a place where you have a belief, and then I'm always interested in anything that is the opposite. Anything of the opposite of what I believe in any sphere of my life. I'm interested to know why. Why is that? Why are people believing that? What am I missing? I hate being caught out. I hate being wrong. I hate it. So I don't wanna stand up in front of 200 people and say something, and then someone says, "That's wrong because of this," and I'm like, "Oh my goodness, it is wrong," you know? Then I go away and look at it, and that's what John did to me, John Archer, he said, "They do it too," and I was like, "I'm gonna prove you different," I'm gonna prove that's not correct. So, yeah, I think you've got to have that open-minded curiosity, otherwise there's no point in researching because we already know, you know?
Well,
And
that's
we
why it's
don't know.
that's why it's important to take politics out of research because so much of it is politically
Yeah.
unpopular. I think about all of the amazing researchers in this field. You mentioned John Archer. I'd put you in that category as well. I spoke to
Oh,
John Dutton, the late Murray Strauss, who was, I'm jealous to say, a friend of yours. Erin Pitsey speaks for
oh,
herself. Richard Jealous, Susan
yeah.
Steinmetz. So many incredible world-leading researchers all saying the same thing, which is it's not gendered. Women can be violent. A large amount of violence is bilateral, and it's not
Mhm.
as black and white as we like to think. And it's amazing how many incredible researchers for decades now have stood up and said that and presented hundreds of papers, and
Mhm.
yet it's not enough. People totally refuse to accept the reality, the empirical reality that it's not gendered. So, what is your best guess as to why people are so stubborn?
I mean, it does come across as counterintuitive,
Mm,
doesn't it? I
yeah.
mean, men are stronger, men fight more, amongst men, although I think there's research to suggest that women fight probably quite as much between themselves. But I do understand the perspective of people who are champion violence against women and girls, because for them, it's been a long struggle to
Mm,
have domestic abuse recognised as a criminal offence, not something that goes on behind closed doors and we leave that the privacy of the family, They might be feeling like, once you start talking about bi-directional domestic abuse, that people are gonna throw their hands up and say, "Well, everyone's as bad as each other, and nobody will care then."
mm.
I understand there are people, many, many people, probably most of the people in that field have the best intentions. There are others who haven't got the best intentions, who are literally feathering their academic nest by just pandering to, the common zeitgeist, and those who go against that, you do it at the detriment. It's harder to publish. You get the papers rejected outright. You get more stringent reviews. You're not invited to conferences. You don't get funding. It's academic suicide for many to actually go down this route. So those that do, they are trying hard, and they are not helping their own career, to be honest. I mean, I was lucky at the University of Lancashire because they were always very good. As long as your research is robust, they always supported it.
I totally agree. I mean, I've had lots of students, PhD students, trying to write theses and studies on violent women, and like all of the ethical approval and all the processes slow way
Mhm.
down, and it never even gets passed.
Mm.
Like they're actually stopped from doing the research I want to do because it seems to be politically unpopular. Whilst
Yeah.
on the so-called other side, there's researchers that just do the worst research possible. We can talk about Michael Johnson in a bit, but he's a good example,
Mhm.
and it gets published without a second thought, like no scrutiny. That's why I like the space because I think if if you've got what it takes to exist in this space, you've got to be made out of iron to have made it this far, which basically self-selects people into being really strong, credible researchers and also having great personalities to actually withstand what it takes to stay here.
Mm.
I'd love to hear some examples of some of the pushback. You described yourself as becoming persona non grata yourself, but what else has happened to other people that you might know or in the space in general to stop them researching these things, violent women and bilateral violence?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Erin was one of the founders. She set up the first refuge, and then she made the mistake of talking about many of the women who went to the refuge were as violent as the men they'd left, that there was fights in the refuges, the women were violent to their own children, and so forth. So she was the one who saw hands-on, and from that moment on, had always been open about it. And, she has been absolutely mithered and terrorized by, certain factions of the academic and other world, really. I mean, when I saw her talk in Sacramento, we all stood up and clapped her when she came on, and she said it was the first time that people all stood up when she came in. First time people hadn't walked out. You've got to have nerves of steel to be doing that work, and she did, and she still does,
And she's
you
the
know?
sweetest
Yeah.
person ever. Like, you would have thought she'd be so bitter and resentful, but she's totally not like that at all. She's such a kind
Yeah.
soul.
And she's got a great sense of humour, and she's doing it because she knows that to ignore women's violence is to leave that woman in a state where she can never get her interpersonal needs met without using aggression. You're not giving her an opportunity to be the woman she wants to be and to be the parent she wants to be. You're just denying that. And that's terrible to do that to somebody.
Well, that was my next question. Like, this very narrow political view of intimate partner violence, domestic violence. I'd love to know, how does that hurt women? Because if you're erasing violent women, like you said, you're erasing someone that could receive treatment. Violence isn't like an end point. People can be treated for violence and it doesn't have to stay that way. But
Mm.
if we refuse to see violent women, then we are only allowing those women to live lives of violence and to be obviously vulnerable to violence from a partner in return. So how does this narrow view of domestic violence hurt women too?
If you fail to accept that a woman is violent, then you fail to then recognise what needs she has and therefore decide on what your course of action as a professional is. So if somebody's using violence, as I say, apart from the rare psychopaths, they're normally using it in a reactive way. So they're reacting to something either external or internal, often a bit of both. And that's how they're solving this problem, because they don't have the skills, they can't manage how they feel, they can't manage their own emotions. So essentially they manage their environment, and that's by using aggression. So it means their relationships are combative, they're never fulfilling, their parenting's often called into question, they get children taken off them, and that's just trauma and trauma and trauma and trauma, It's beyond belief that we can think we're protecting women by not recognising their needs in terms of their own violence.
And obviously, as you mentioned, the most violent women are often same-sex lesbian relationships. And obviously that's very obvious how they're left vulnerable if we're not looking at violent women, because we just ignore them completely on both sides.
Yeah, because that can't fit the narrative, you see. Lesbian utopia is a term in the research, If you've got two women, then it could be a perfect relationship. So, this is undermining our whole view of women when we find that there's equal, if not more, sort of like relationships where there's violence in them.
Yeah, add that to the list of things that don't quite make sense. But what I really like that you just said there is that a lot of domestic violence is about someone being unable to regulate their emotions. And if you can't regulate your
Mm.
emotions, you regulate your environment. And often your
Mhm.
partner or your family is your environment. And that's such
Yeah.
a really great way of thinking about it, that moves domestic violence out of the political lens and into the psychological and scientific lens. And I know there's a lot of people pushing to do that. To let's not talk about domestic
Mm.
violence as a political thing, and let's talk about the
Yeah.
psychology and the science behind it. So what tools do you want people to pick up, either psychologically or scientifically, to help better understand violence, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, that does away with the gendered feminist narrative and brings in the tools of science?
There's a lot of talk about, generally in services, and rightly so, about adverse childhood experiences. So 30 years ago, substance users were seen as, willful, and,
Mm.
everyone gave up on them. It was quite punitive approaches and so forth, but that's completely changed now. Now we're very recovery focused, what needs to happen. And what we know about people who have got substance use problems, people who suffer from a mental health, people who use aggression, is they've often grown up in environments which are really, really threatening. Now, these can be physical abuse, it can be sexual abuse, it can be, coercive control from parents, also like growing up with people using drugs. There's a big old long list of ACEs, is what they're called.
Mm.
And the research is clear that people with ACEs are more likely to, as adults, be involved in violent relationships, substance use, suicidality, mental health problems, live in poverty, failure at school. So it's very broad. It's not just violence. Violence is just one part of this whole cluster of outcomes from growing up in an unsafe, unvalidating environment, which is what these people have. And then when you look at so what does that do to your brain? It changes how your brain responds to threat, your emotion regulation. So if you imagine that someone who grew up in a nice, normal family, things were dealt with in a non-violent way and so forth, your sort of say your emotion level ticks along at 3 or 4. It's ticking along. It's normal. I'm awake. I'm aroused. I can enjoy things. I can feel annoyed about things, but I can manage all this.
Mm.
Somebody had a lot of ACEs can find that they're actually ticking over. It's like 6 or 7. Now at 6 or 7, and all of us are going to be feeling very unhappy. We're going to be feeling agitated, upset, and so forth. If I'm starting at 2 or 3, I can take quite a lot of annoyances during the day to get to 6 or 7. At 6 or 7, I'm going out for a cigarette or a coffee. I'm going to go walk around the park. I know that I'm feeling a bit annoyed. Best to sort of do something about it. But if you're starting at 7, it doesn't take much. What would take, it takes a few things to put you at 8, 9, 10. Now, at that point, the blood flow from the front of your brain where you think and problem solve, that blood is being diverted to the back of your brain, to your amygdala, your emotion center. And that is saying, do something, act, we have to escape. This is why ACEs are so important in understanding this. So I would like a shift from this idea of, for men, accountability and control, controlling the men because they're badged as the perpetrators, to one of understanding, what is it that is driving your aggression? Because some are power and control, yeah. We recognise there are some people who are, like we said, psychopathic, but most people aren't. Most people aren't like that. So they're trying to manage, but they've got emotion systems like driving a Ferrari. You can't just put your foot down on a Ferrari pedal. You're going to hit a wall. You're going to go too fast.
Mm.
So, I would like us to start focusing more on what is the psychological drivers of domestic abuse. And therefore, if we know it's emotion regulation is a big driver, and the ACEs are part of the conversation that got people into this highly reactive emotional state, then we need to give these people the tools that they never learned growing up to manage that, for themselves, within themselves. So then they can be calmer and they can make choices that are healthy for themselves and their families.
I mean, this makes total sense. It makes
Mm.
total common sense. You don't need a PhD to understand that.
No,
It
no.
seems to be about the lessons we teach to kids. I'm reminded of Murray Strauss's work and how he spent a lifetime trying to get parents not to hit their children. And he made that point of you're teaching a child that they can use violence to solve misbehavior, which when you grow up, if you do that exact thing to your partner, you're committing intimate partner violence. But that's something that children
Mm.
can learn and then carry into adulthood.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
yet we never look at these frameworks. And one of the things that Don Dutton talked to me about, I asked him for 2 bits of advice if he could take over and start treating domestic violence on a national level. And he said, I would put money into childcare to make sure the first few years of life are as comfortable as possible,
Mhm.
which sort of rings to what you were talking about. And then he would say, and I would move as much domestic violence intervention out of being a criminal police thing and make it about couples therapy and teaching people those skills of emotional regulation and communication so they don't resort to violence. Obviously, there were some forms of intimate partner violence, domestic violence that are severe, and that is a police matter. But do you think a large portion of domestic violence should be approached by couples therapy and that sort of therapeutic intervention?
Yeah, I understand the need for police intervention in, domestic abuse where there's, real risk of harm. And I work in this field, and sometimes that threat of police action is needed to actually get people to engage in services, because people are often very ashamed of what's happened. They don't want to talk about it. They're very avoidant. Many people who are referred to services never show up, you
Mm.
know. So I understand that aspect of it, but it shouldn't be the only offer, is criminalisation because, it actually puts victims off as well. If your perpetrator is the breadwinner, then, if they're arrested, then they lose a job and then you have no income. There's lots of impacts on the victim as well. It needs to be more nuanced. Some people need a police response, 100%.
Mm.
Other people need support. And couples therapy, yeah, it's very controversial. Although the outcomes from research, Stiff has done, and her team, they've looked at quite a lot of this research and may find that it's as effective, if not more effective than, like single sex sort of groups.
Wow.
But I think there's merit, and whenever I've been asked by social workers to work with a couple, I'll always talk to them separately. We'll make a assessment, we'll talk to a victim and say, would you be, comfortable with this? And, you'd look at the dynamics. You've got to be careful about couples therapy, obviously, but I don't think it should be ruled out. But at the very least, you get a psychologically informed program designed around the current research, the robust research, not the one paper that says X, the meta-analyses where they've taken all the research and they've summarized like overall what we're seeing. So, and there's lots and lots of those around. Having that mindset, like we want to help, so we have to understand how to help. We have to understand what's driving it and what's going to help prevent it happening again.
And then, so how does that compare to what's currently happening? I know, obviously, if the police are called and you are arrested or found guilty of being a violent man, normally you're put on often like a Duluth court-mandated program. So what does that look like? How are we currently treating domestic violence and those perpetrating it?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to say that certainly in the UK, there has been a big shift. Now, there are programs that are still Duluth sort of orientated, but there are increasingly programs that are changing how we're doing it. They're recognising how to engage clients. People with ACEs often, very shame prone. So you'd be going hard and say, tell me everything you've done, take full responsibility at the first session. They're just not going to come back. So you're not helping the victim there, because that person's disengaged. And when people disengage from programs, they are statistically more likely to reoffend. Essentially, we need to be trying to understand the perspective of that person and trying to stay neutral, because in a program, you're not a criminal justice system. You're there to help that person have other ways of understanding the world, communicating with people, managing their own emotions and so forth. That's our job. And there is a sea change, and I'm seeing it more and more. If you are working in the traditional programs, it must be absolutely so destroying to start, you get 10 men in a room and then they all drop off, or you're getting like active hostility, because you're imposing, you did it for this reason. You're not asking. And they're like, no, I didn't. So you end up fighting with them, verbally, and it's all this resistance. And doing this work is hard. It takes a lot out of you. But there is a change. It is happening. What we really need to do is, a lot of the work is funded by the Home Office, and they really need to do a proper review. They need to know who's been referred to what programs, who's engaging, which programs are holding people, which ones are not, which ones are then subsequently reducing this to children, reducing reoffending and so forth. And they could do that because they're the funders. They can tell us whatever they want us to collect. We have to collect that data and pass it on. So, there's no reason not to do it.
Well, I would have thought that was already happening. Surely the first thing you'd do
Mhm.
is that intervention programs, you'd be like, we need to know what are the results so we can keep doing the ones that work and stop doing the ones that don't. So is there no one capturing that data?
Not as far as I know. I hear there's moves to do an evaluation. So the Home Office will say give money to a local authority, and then it'll be up to them what information they collect, and it'll be on them to commission evaluations, which they obviously often can't afford because they're expensive. Because they're often done through universities, which have quite large overheads, which they have to do to, keep running. So yeah, it's surprising. It's surprising. We have a lot of great stats. We know how to collect data. You don't have to go through loads of paper copies. You could have a performer, electronic, something, and you could just say, if you're getting funding, you are required to send these in, and then they can run the stats themselves. And I really hope they do. I really hope they do. I mean, we've been evaluated on the programme we did, and it was completely independent. Yeah, it went. We've had 2 different evaluations in our work, and they've been positive.
So that's an intervention program that you ran that's been evaluated.
And it's trauma informed. Trauma informed. It's just based on the research because I'm a researcher. So when I hear ACEs, then I go and look at what are ACEs, what are the outcomes of ACEs, so what do we need to do? There's other things such as mentalisation. So children who grow up in dangerous homes, psychologically or physically dangerous homes, they often will learn to not mentalise. So I don't want to think what that person's thinking. So if my parents screaming at me with this vitriol, I don't want to then think they hate me. People can actually find it very hard to mentalise, to actually think, why would somebody be doing that? So it's almost like a mind blindness that people can get. So they're not curious because it was protective growing up, but then you carry that on into your adulthood. And it just means it makes it very hard for you to have fulfilling relationships because you need to be able to think, well, why is that person doing that? They're not doing it because they're evil. What are they trying to achieve? What's gone on? And you can teach it. We do it. We do it. And for the people you work with, they love it because it's new and they've never thought about it before. And quite a few get really quite excited about it. It's not rocket science. It's not hard.
A lot of the things we're told about why men are violent is down to what you said, power and control, and they're trying to use patriarchal oppression or intimate terrorism to control and dominate the partner. But whenever I speak to people who worked with violent men, intervention programs, and you're not the first person, they obviously sit down with these men and they find out exactly why they were violent. And it's so rarely, if ever, a political reason. It's like this common sense stuff. I was angry. I didn't feel heard. I wanted her attention. So what are the main reasons that you found working with violent men and women that motivates their violence?
It's often feelings, like you said, of not being heard, not being seen, not being loved, not being taken seriously, being ignored, whether that's objectively the case, but it's how they feel. And how you feel is how you behave. Your feelings are a big driver of behaviour. So yeah, it's very difficult for people who have grown up in homes where they haven't been able to learn these skills, haven't seen how adults negotiate, disagreements and so forth. Like, how are we meant to know how to do this?
Yeah.
It isn't natural for everybody. It's something that luckily we can be taught.
I mean, I am one of the lucky ones because I was never hit as a child. My parents taught me to solve the problems with diplomacy and conversation and patience. And obviously I grow up now. I'm not violent myself either, but when I have a problem with someone, I don't shout. I certainly don't get violent, but I talk to them and I am trying to be diplomatic. And it is something that you can be taught either in childhood or you can learn as an adult. It doesn't have to be as scary as the political views of male violence. And I feel like we need to sort of destigmatize violence in many ways and be like, in many ways, it's a kind of disease that can be treated and should be treated.
And we've got the techniques now. We've got the techniques, like the sort of stuff around the ACEs. If you're looking at emotionally unstable personality disorder, it used to be called borderline, that's all about emotion regulation. And I've been lucky to do forensic training and things like that through my work at University of Lancashire. And, so I got to deliver these programs at high secure hospitals. I've delivered in prisons and stuff. It works. You can just bring that mental health approach into domestic abuse, because that's where it should be.
It's actually a great book about borderline. It teaches people who are in relationships with people with borderline personality disorder, and it's called Stop Walking on Eggshells, of all things. So,
Yeah.
highly relatable.
Yeah, I mean, John Dutton's work on the abusive personality was very much around the borderline sort of clusters of traits. I remember reading that when I was a student thinking, wow, this really makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, even me with my A level in psychology, D, I can read Don's work and your work and be like, it makes so much sense. Of course, that makes sense. Some of the
Mm.
research that makes less sense. You mentioned Michael Johnson, Professor Michael Johnson. He was obviously on the opposite side of this conversation. So a lot of people like Murray Strauss putting out work that showed domestic violence isn't gendered, it's more or less equal in terms of victimization. In comes Michael Johnson with his typology of violence. And he's like, yeah, that's sort of true, but guess what? Men's violence is different to women's.
Mm.
Men's violence, as you described at the beginning, it's to dominate and to oppress and coerce and to control.
Mhm.
Whereas women's violence is more reactive. They're struggling against the oppressor or the intimate terrorist, as Michael Johnson coined. But it sounds like you went from having that point of view, mainly based on your own personal experiences, to having the point of view you have now, where it's, again, not that
Mhm.
simple. And that seems to be based on a huge amount of research. I think your PhD was on the topology of violence.
Mhm.
So what can
Yeah.
you tell us about Michael Johnson's work and how it is contradicted by your work and this idea of intimate terrorism? And what is that?
So, yeah, I mean, Michael Johnson says on, well, I don't know if his website's still up, but he says he's a feminist. So that's him being very open,
Mm,
that that's his approach. So for him, when he saw the figures of equal numbers of men and women reporting using violence towards a partner in these large scale studies,
mm,
he saw, and rightly so, to understand what that was. But what he did was he had a selected sample. So you had women who were victims of violence, and then they reported on what their partners did.
mm,
So you're selecting a sample which is biased
mm,
against men, and he never asked men what they did and what their partners did to them. So obviously for him, he did the research and I loved it. Like I say, it was the start of my PhD. I was thought, fantastic, this explains these figures, and he thought it did too. And he cites my earlier work where it was following his sort of same framework.
mm.
But once I sort of realised that I really need to ask men and women the same things and sample them in the same way and found something different, then that's a point at which Michael Johnson would have definitely got my paper to review, and it was literally, yeah, no. No, no. I mean, there are good journals that look at just how robust the paper is, and, I did publish them, but he never cited them.
Oh,
After that. He only cites this really old paper, my first one ever.
yeah. I mean, I constantly change my mind on my view of domestic violence. I started off where you did, and then I went back to gender parity. And then I remember reading Michael Johnson's research, and I was like, oh my God, I've been so stupid. Of course,
Yeah.
the most violent partners are men. And then you read the sources of his research, and one of them was in shelters for women, and one of them was for men in
Mm.
prisons. And I was like, obviously, if you're sampling men in prisons and you're also sampling women in shelters, you're going to get a very biased result. And that's
Mm.
exactly what he came back with. So then I was changing my mind again. And I was like, actually, no.
Yeah, yeah. I know. But that's for people who have a worldview. And I hope it is his worldview. I hope he wasn't just doing it because he didn't want to upset anybody. I hope he believed it,
Mm.
because at least that's authentic. I don't know if he did or not. I never met my man in person. I would have liked to have chatted to him about this, but yeah, it was a good stepping stone in the research, because it isn't just who does what to whom. The coercive control is an important part, and it was, largely ignored in those
Mm.
early research studies. But I designed a scale for my PhD, which is used in lots of research now by other people. And once you ask men and women what they did and what their partner did, that's you find that parity and coercion as well.
Totally agree. So I
Mm.
would love to hear, what is this idea of intimate terrorism? If he's saying it's almost only men doing it, and you're saying it's not that simple, it's more even, what is intimate terrorism? And what is the typology of violence? Like, just for the layperson, can you describe that sort of concept and framework to me?
Yeah. So as Michael Johnson frames it, intimate terrorism is what men do. And that is, they may or may not use physical violence, but what they do is they're highly coercive. They didn't have to be violent, but that coercion, high coercion, was the intimate terrorism. Common couple violence, later termed situational couple violence, is where you've got two, a man and a woman, and they normally tick along, and then sometimes, stresses come, someone loses a job, or there's a new child in their family, and everyone's a bit short-tempered, and there's minor, sometimes severe, but some abuse, but then it settles down again. But intimate terrorism is this idea that it is a constant pressure within that relationship, that intimate terrorism is there all the time.
And then, so what has your research found? If he's saying it's only men doing that, what did you find?
No, it was equal. So we asked men and women what they did and what their partner did. And yeah, pretty much the same. Men and women pretty much agreed. A lot of it was I check up on my partner checks up on me. So it was, but people tended to mirror each other's behaviour. But there were, relationships definitely in there was clearly one person who was an intimate terrorist and the other person was non-violent at all or more situationally violent. So there isn't just, two categories. There's all sorts. You can have two intimate terrorists, you can have two violent resistance, you can have two common couple violence, whatever, you've got these categories, you can mix them up as much as you like. The most common is situational couple violence, where there's stresses, things get a bit heated and then it settles down and there's not that sort of constant fear by one or both parties. So.
I appreciate a lot of Michael Johnson's work. I think it's really important. I think it's good that we separate out different forms of violence because it's not all just one monolithic blob. There are different types and different motivations and different impacts. But just to go over what you said, there's two classes of domestic violence. There's the intimate terrorism where one partner is trying to control the other one, not necessarily just through physical violence or not even with any physical violence, but also coercion. And you're trying to control that other person, dominate or terrorize them. And then the second form of violence is situational violence, where the violence is more about the situation you're in. It's a stressful situation. Someone's angry. It's occasional violence. It's not motivated by the same thing. And then you have different combinations. You might have a terrorist with someone that's situationally violent, or you might have someone that's situationally violent and someone that's not violent, or you might have two intimate partner terrorists. And I think that's really useful. I think it's great that we've stratified it in that way. What I didn't appreciate was how he's gendered that. And then more so, the research based on is so obviously flawed and the sample size are very small. And that's why I think you coming along challenging him is the ultimate combo where he's brought in a higher resolution of domestic violence and you've brought in more data, more modern data, less biased data. And together it seems to be like the perfect combo. One of the things I read from Murray Strauss about intimate partner terrorism, it was the same thing as what I said earlier about bilateral violence, where he found that when one partner is violent, women are far more likely to be injured, like significantly more likely to be injured. However, when both partners are violent, the overall rates of violence for both men and women skyrockets by about 5 times, and the likelihood of injury is the same, which I found just so interesting and also shocking. But I'm going to read back to you what you found in your intimate partner terrorism research, and correct me if I get this wrong, but a study of 1,339 university staff and students using the same criteria Johnson used found 13% of women and 9% of men were intimate terrorists. And a second mode of analysis of the same data found 23% of women and 7% of men were intimate terrorists. Does that sound about right?
Yeah. I haven't looked at that for many years, but yeah. You've also got violent resistance as well. That's another category of Michael Johnson's. And mutual violent control, which is actually more common than Michael Johnson talk about. Yeah.
The thing is, that's what's so annoying, because important research like his is so muddled up with politics and money and funding. You're sort of losing the efficacy of it. We don't know why Michael Johnson's putting out biased research, or did. It could be he doesn't know any better, or it could be he's got political agenda getting in the way of what would otherwise be really, really important research.
And he said he was a feminist, and he said back years ago, so if that's his worldview, he was at least explicit in what it was. And so you have to read his work with that, knowing that that's his lens. That's what he believes. So that's what he's looking for.
No, I agree. And I mean, I think everyone's
Mm.
probably got their own biases, including
Oh, certainly.
ourselves. I just want to, I just want to go back one more time to the whole bilateral violence. And if we can take as relatively accurate that half of all intimate partner violence is bilateral, where both partners are feeding into it, that means that half the people that are victims of violence are perpetrators in their own right. And I feel like if we're going to reach the progress we talked about in terms of helping the most amount of people possible, getting over that hurdle of not just seeing people as just victims or just perpetrators and seeing that half the time it's both. I hope this conversation has helped people understand it's not quite simple as good guy and bad guy. But I'd
Mm.
just love to give you one more chance to just talk to people about how it's not as simple as good and bad, black and white, blue team, red team, male oppressor, female damsel. There's a lot that's going on in the grey area. So how do we navigate that grey area in a way that is sensitive to people's experiences and is something that we can navigate together?
Well, I suppose the only way is to take every incident, every couple, every person as you find them, and to be open, to say if they're a victim of violence, have you been abusive too? And if they say yeah, then you say, right, well, we can help you with that because we can. There are programs for that. But what we do is to help people manage their emotions better. That's going to help you whether you're a victim or a perpetrator. It's asking people questions in a way that they feel they can honestly answer, which isn't going to immediately trigger something that is going to be catastrophic for them, such as like, oh, well, now you're going to be, put on this list. It's having human conversations with people, talking to them like they are a valid human being, and seeking to understand what is going on with you, what is happening. And people will always tell the truth, but if you're using a therapeutic program where people are learning skills as they go through it, you'll often find people who completely denied any behavior which could be seen as, abusive. You'll find that quite a few of those people later on will say, no, I actually recognise where I was abusive because they start understanding why it was. So where they felt they were righteous, once you realise that actually how did the other person feel, how was your behaviour impacting them, you can then
Mm,
start feeling like, oh yeah, I can actually see how my behaviours influence what happened. And that's not to say that, the other person's behaviour was valid, but unless you've got the skills to not do it, then it's always on the cards, isn't it? It's always can happen. So the only
mm,
way we help people is to, I don't think we should be asking people to take accountability at the beginning. I don't think we should expect people to be able to talk about what happened at the beginning. The police have done their work. You've got a list. You know what's been alleged to have happened. Yeah, talk about that at the end when that person has the skills to understand what were the alternatives there. What could I have
mm.
done differently? What could have been different if I'd just done X, Y, or Z?
I mean, it's accountability again. It's another grey area. So I do think we are all accountable for our decisions. But at the
Mhm.
same time, as we know, domestic violence isn't just like a contained problem, it's a generational problem. A lot of people that are abusive were themselves abused in childhood. So it's very difficult for them to be accountable for their actions when in many ways it was something that was passed down to them and taught to them as a child. But then at the same time, I do recognize that we are human beings, we are adults, and we are accountable. There's no justifying violence whatsoever. So it's just a very difficult conversation to have. And the final area, the grey area, I want to ask you about, Nicola. I got into a lot of trouble not long ago because there was a study that came out in Australia that found 1 in 3 men were perpetrators of intimate partner violence, which is a shockingly high number. But if you look at the survey, the main question that generated the lion's share of that percentage was, have you ever made your partner feel anxious or afraid at all? And I'm not talking about being afraid. I think making someone feel afraid is serious.
Mm.
But making someone feel anxious, my point was just because I made someone feel anxious doesn't mean I've abused them. And it certainly doesn't mean I've been violent towards them. And that was a great
Mm.
example of a survey that I feel like used a very vague and very low
Mhm.
bar for intimate partner violence. So it could create these shocking headlines, which it did. But I can think loads of ways in which I've made my girlfriend feel anxious that is totally benign and not abusive. So that's obviously a difficult line to draw. What is normal behavior to expect in a grown-up relationship, And when does that become abuse? And then a time to actually seek help.
I mean, for me, I would say when you're starting to not do what you want to do, doing things you don't want to do, and you're sort of like adapting your behavior to avoid the other person's disapproval or mood threats or whatever. If you're stopping doing normal things because your partner will be irrationally upset by that, then yeah, I think that is abusive. Whether that's a police matter, depends. But certainly from a relationship point of view, you feel that you can't be yourself and live the life you should be able to lead because you're having to change your behaviour so that you don't get, backlash from them, whether physical or emotional. And that's my litmus test. You know, if you're not living how you want to, then something needs to change.
Such a good point. I think a lot of people resonate with that. The problem again is that these things don't happen overnight. They happen quite gradually often. I
Mhm.
think about when I used to live with a flatmate, and I'm sure some of the things she did would be considered abusive. I remember I felt so uncomfortable around her, and I would stay in my room. I'd wait for her. I'd listen for her to leave, and I'd run downstairs and do the things I need to do. I wouldn't want her to be there when I got back from work, so I'd spend ages walking home from work. Literally doing whatever I can to delay that. And I remember looking down at my desk in my room and seeing a whole series of cutlery because I didn't want to eat in the dining room or kitchen, and I'd order food to my room, and I was like, "That isn't right. That isn't
No,
right that
that's
I'm
it.
scared in my own house." And I was like looking
Yeah,
at the cutlery and I was thinking about my behavior, and I was like, "I'm sure that would qualify as abuse because I did
yeah,
change my behavior, not for the better, and it was because of her." And she didn't raise a single finger. There was no
yeah.
violence whatsoever, and she did it all verbally and relationally and psychologically. And that's another way in which I hope people listening can expand their idea of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, that it's not all physical.
Mm,
A lot of it is emotional and coercive, and it creeps up on you, and you don't
mm,
realize it's happened until
mm,
you take a step back and you're like, actually, my life is different now, and not in a good
mm,
way.
yeah. And I'm sure that your flatmate would not recognise what you were saying. That's the thing, isn't it? It's always from your own perspective, you know? Some people know that
Mm,
they're, oppressing others. Many people don't realise it. They just can't manage their own emotions, so they manage the environment by being, like, cold or, stomping
that's
around and
exactly what it
so
was.
forth. Yeah, yeah,
You'd
that's it.
feel it when she comes into the room, like, you'd
Yeah,
feel the colour leave the room. And
yeah.
I'm quite a big guy, I'll say what I think, I'm not afraid of people, and she was, like, quite significantly younger and smaller than me, and I was like, "This doesn't make sense, I don't
Mhm,
normally behave like this, I'm quite big personality," and sh somehow, without me even realising, she just managed to shrink me down into a little blob of a human, and, well, obviously, that's a long
yeah.
time ago and things have changed.
No, but it's a good insight, isn't it?
Really useful. There's women in my life now who have had their lives utterly destroyed by other women, and not only have they not been violent, but they've never even met. And it's like it's possible to
Mhm,
destroy someone's life completely without doing anything
yeah,
physical, without even meeting them. And all of those cards on the table when it comes to abuse. And it isn't just about who's bigger and who's stronger or more physically violent. We need to stop painting the picture with that brush, not this it's male
mm,
oppression, patriarchy, physical violence. So I want to end on a good note because it sounds like you were giving me some good
mhm.
news. Things seem to be changing. And I think I
I
agree.
think so.
You were saying that
I think so.
there aren't many belief models left, but as we're moving to a more progressive scientific view of intimate partner violence, domestic abuse. So
Yeah.
continuing on that thread, how are things changed in the past 10 or 20 years since you've been in this space?
I think there's definitely more awareness of male victims, and there is some awareness of same-sex relationship victimology, but that's still in its infancy. And I think program providers are open to new ways of thinking that will help them actually deliver contracts that they're awarded. Almost all of the people I've met who are working in services are trying to do their best. They really are. They are trying to do something different, and it can be hard to change a worldview because God knows I agonized over it when I had to. But they're brave and they will do
Mm.
it and they are doing it. And I just hope that we can get an evaluation that looks at all the programs we're funding and start saying, well, what works for whom and why? So maybe every program works for someone. Well, so who does it work for? And have a range of options. So this sort of person, family only versus the generally violent versus the dysphoric, mentally unwell type people. Like, understand who we're working with and then be able to allocate them to the appropriate program.
So, sticking with services, I'd love to know what sort of services do you think men need now, and what services are out there that you'd recommend men who are in abusive relationships should access or seek?
I mean, I always say to people, Mankind Initiative, so good, very, very focused, they very much know the landscape, they can offer a lot of advice. What we've had in with women is we've had literally decades of awareness raising. You can't go into a toilet in a pub if you're a woman without shutting the door and saying, "Has this happened to you?" Phone missed things. You see it everywhere. Violence Against Women and Girls Act, which does include men and boys, which is a whole different conversation. So the reason we have all this awareness for women was so that they recognise what was happening to them was abusive, and other people would recognise it. All that was put in place to protect women. We need to now catch up with men and same-sex couples as well. We need to do the same campaigning. They should be on the buses. When you go to a toilet as a man, you should have a sticker on the back saying, "Does your partner do X, Y, and Z?" And you should be able to phone a helpline and not be screened as a perpetrator as well. You should be treated in the same way we treat women.
No, I totally agree. I think there has definitely been a shift. I've seen it too in the short tenure in which I've been here. It's not perfect, far from it, but it's definitely a lot better than it was 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 50 years ago. And I'd agree. I'd absolutely echo the Mankind thing. Anyone listening that needs help, call Mankind. They're an amazing charity that do support male victims.
And the other thing is, men need to start asking men, "Why can't you come out, mate? Why have you got scratches on your face?" Women, we'd be all over that. If one of my friends couldn't come out because she said, "My husband doesn't want me going out," we'd be like, "Right, we're having an intervention ourselves." If I saw a female friend with bruises, I'd be asking her what it's about. Individual men have to step up. You need to start talking to your male friends. I'm saying that's abuse, mate.
So how do we find your work? Is there a website, or how do we read your research, Nicola?
The University of Lancashire has got a depository where they put research in. Otherwise, I think a lot of my papers, you can just Google my name, you'll find quite a lot of the papers.
Well, as someone that's Googled your name many times, you definitely can find lots of great research by Googling you. And I've seen your LinkedIn too. And if there's any final words, Nicola, please share them. But thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you for doing this. It's not something you're going to earn a lot of happy faces, I imagine, at the current landscape, but it's important work you're doing, so I'll keep doing it.
Well, likewise, I feel I'm one of the next generation, so hopefully I can move the needle a bit further. Like,
I hope so.
started with Murray and Erin, and then you, and then hopefully me, if I can put myself on the same level. So yeah, it's an honour, and I appreciate that, and it's a lot more fun than it's difficult. And yeah, thanks again, Nicola, for your time.
No problem
And
at all.
I hope everyone checks out your work.
Thank you. Bye-bye.